Arizona Territory, 1882. The sun had not yet cleared the red cliffs over Whittler's Ridge when Israel Boone spotted the woman curled up on the wooden step of the small clapboard church, dust clinging to her skirt, her face streaked with dried tears. He pulled his horse to a stop, the creak of his saddle loud in the quiet morning. The place was still too still. No one in town slept on church steps unless they had nowhere else to go. Israel dismounted and stepped close, boots scuffing the dirt. The woman stirred, blinked up into the light. Her hair was tangled, the color of honey, and her eyes were the softest gray he had ever seen. She looked up at him like someone who had forgotten how to hope. "You all right, madam?" She sat up slowly, knees pulled to her chest. "I do not know where I am," she said, voice raw. "I walked for 2 days." Israel crouched down beside her. "This is Whittler's Ridge. You got a name?" She hesitated. Josephine Green. "You hurt?" "No, just tired." She looked away. "And alone." Israel looked over his shoulder at the empty street. The town would be waking soon, but there were not many kind souls left in it. His gaze dropped back to her, to the way her hands trembled in her lap. She was no more than 20, maybe 21, and she looked like someone who had lost everything. "My name's Israel Boone." He stood, offered a hand. "Come on, you can eat, rest. You do not need to explain anything." She stared at his hand like she did not believe it was real. Then slowly she reached up and took it. Israel lived a mile out on a patch of land that had once belonged to his father. The ride was quiet. Josephine sat behind him on the saddle, arms wrapped tight around herself. She did not speak, and he did not press her. He had known silence like that before. His cabin was small but clean. She looked around like she had not been inside 4 walls in weeks. He left her with a plate of eggs and bread and stepped out to tend the horses, giving her room. When he came back in, she was asleep in the chair. Food barely touched, her head resting against the wall. He watched her for a while, uneasy. She looked too thin, like she had not eaten properly in days. He draped a blanket over her shoulders and sat across the room, arms folded. He had not meant to get involved. He had only come into town for supplies, but there she was. She woke late afternoon, startled and quiet. He poured her coffee, sat across from her again. "I will take you back into town tomorrow if you want," he said. "Do not," she said quickly. "Please." He waited. "I was going to marry a man in Prescott," she said after a while. "But when I arrived, he had already gone, left 2 weeks before, no message, nothing." She looked down. "I had nowhere to go. I walked until I could not any more." Israel watched her. "He left you like that?" Josephine nodded. "I do not know why I came here," she said. "I just kept walking." "You came the right way," he said simply. She looked at him, startled. "You do not even know me." "I do not need to know everything to see you are good," he said. "I know bad when I see it. You are not that." Her eyes filled, but she blinked fast, holding it in. "You gonna be all right?" he asked. She hesitated. Then, "I do not want to be alone again." Israel nodded slowly. "Then do not be," she frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He stood, walked to the window. Outside, the sun was dipping low, painting the world gold. He turned back to her, heart thudding hard in his chest. "I have land, I have work, I live quiet, I do not have much, but what I have is mine. And I would never leave someone the way you were left." Josephine sat frozen, hands clasped on her lap. "You do not have to say yes," he said. "But I am saying it now, clear. If you want to stay, you can. If you want a name, I will give you mine. If you want a home, this can be it." She stared at him. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." Her lips parted. "Why?" "Because I see you, and something in me says you are meant to be here. Meant to be with me." She stood, slow and careful, like the floor might shift under her feet. Her eyes were wet again, but she did not look away. "Yes," she whispered. "I do not want to be alone anymore." He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hands. She did not flinch. She looked right at him, and in that moment something shifted between them, quiet and strong. "I will ride with you to the preacher," she said. "Tonight." He nodded. They left before dark. The preacher's wife cried when she heard. The preacher himself, a kind man with a tired voice, married them right there in the front room, with the same church step Josephine had slept on only that morning, sitting silent in the dusk outside. When they came back to the cabin, the stars were out. Josephine stood in the doorway looking up at them. "You sure?" Israel asked, watching her. She turned to him. "I have not been sure of much in my life, but I am sure about this." He walked to her, touched her cheek. She leaned into it, her eyes closing for a breath. "I will take care of you," he said. "And I will stay," she whispered. He kissed her then, slow and steady. She pressed close, arms winding around him like she had found something solid at last. And outside, the wind moved through the tall grass, soft and steady, like it knew something good had begun. The morning after they wed, Josephine rose before the sky turned pale. The cabin was quiet but held a peace that felt unfamiliar, like stepping barefoot onto ground not yet claimed by memory. She moved carefully so the floorboards wouldn't creak, pulling on the dress she'd folded over the back of the chair the night before. Israel was still asleep, one arm tucked beneath his head, the other resting across his chest. In sleep, he looked younger, less stern. She watched him a long moment before stepping outside. The chill met her first, sharp and clean. A strand of her hair caught on the wind and danced across her cheek. She held it back with one hand and walked toward the corral where the horses stood quiet, their breath visible in the crisp air. She'd never lived outside a town before, never seen land stretch unbroken except for cottonwoods and fence lines. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full of waiting things. She liked that. Behind her, the cabin door opened with a soft groan. "You always wake this early?" Israel asked, voice sleep rough. "Not always," she said without turning, "but I couldn't stay inside." He joined her at the fence, arms folded, shoulders still heavy with sleep. "You hungry in a while?" She looked up at him. "I could help if there's work." "There's always work, but I don't expect you to jump in your first day." "I wasn't raised to sit idle." She met his gaze and held it this time. "You offered me a place, not a prison." Something passed between them then, an understanding, quiet but solid. He nodded once. "All right, we'll start with the hens. Coops need clearing." She followed him to the side shed where the chickens stirred behind wire and slats. He handed her a bucket, then crouched to unlatch the gate. "You ever handled birds?" "Just enough to know they don't like me." He chuckled once, low in his throat. "They don't like anyone." They worked side by side, not speaking much, but not falling into silence either. She asked what the hens were fed, and he showed her the feed sack. They cleared old straw and laid down new. She watched how he moved, efficient, with a steadiness that made her feel safer than she wanted to admit. By midday, the sun had risen high and sharp over the ridge. They sat on the porch with plates of cornbread and boiled beans, their boots dusty, hands raw from the morning. Josephine shifted the plate on her lap. "Did you build this place?" "My father did. I added the porch and the barn roof. Everything else is as he left it." "Was your mother here too?" For a time, she waited, but he didn't add more. She didn't press. Instead, she said, "You don't ask many questions. You look like someone who's had too many asked already." She studied him a moment, then nodded. "That's true." He set his plate aside, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't need to know everything," he said, "but when you're ready, I'll listen." Josephine looked down at her hands. "I married a man once, just before I turned 19. He had a small shop, nothing fancy. He died of the fever less than a year in." Israel didn't interrupt. "After that, I lived with his sister in Tucson, helped her with sewing and meals. She remarried last winter and her new husband didn't want me there, said I was bad luck. She looked out across the field. So I wrote to a man I'd met once who'd spoken kindly to me, asked if he'd take me in. His letter said yes. Then I arrived and found out he'd gone north to seek gold, left no word. There was no bitterness in her voice, just the shape of what had happened. Israel stood, walked to the railing, and leaned against it. You ever want to go back to Tucson? No, she looked up at him. There's nothing there for me. Then you stay here, as long as you want. She rose slowly, walked to stand beside him. The breeze caught her skirt and pushed it gently against his leg. I want to belong somewhere, she said. You do, he replied without hesitation. She looked at him and his hand found hers, not sudden, not shy, just certain. They stood like that until the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something warm beneath it. She didn't say what she was feeling. She didn't need to. Inside, the stove crackled. The cabin waited. And for the first time since she'd left Tucson, Josephine didn't feel like she was passing through. She felt like she'd come home. By the third morning, Josephine had taken to the rhythm of the place without asking permission. She rose early, swept the hearth before Israel stirred, and started the coffee over the embers. The quiet suited her, but she didn't drift through it. She carried herself with a kind of quiet purpose, like someone who had known too many closed doors and decided not to wait for someone to open the next one. Israel returned from the lower pasture, with his coat dusted in burrs and streaks of sweat darkening his collar. He paused at the threshold, watching her pour coffee into 2 tin cups without looking up. You keep doing that, I'll forget what it means to make my own, he said. Josephine handed him a cup without smiling. Then I'll have done my work right. He sipped and looked down at her boots. You planning to go somewhere? I thought I'd walk to the edge of the ridge, she said. I saw a line of cottonwoods from the barn door. I want to see if there's water near them. You expecting to find something? She met his eyes. Expecting, no. Hoping, yes. Israel nodded once. I'll come with you. You don't have to. I didn't say I did. They walked after breakfast, the sun already strong enough to press sweat between their shoulders. The land sloped gently, packed with dry grass and scattered mesquite. A hawk cut across the sky above them, silent and clean. The cottonwoods stood where she'd seen them, tall and green against the dun-colored earth. And beneath them, not much more than a trickle, ran a narrow stream, half concealed by stones and reeds. Josephine crouched and trailed her fingers through the water. It's real. Israel knelt beside her. Likely fed by snowmelt from the mountains. Doesn't run long, but it's clean. She pulled her hand back and wiped it on the hem of her skirt. Could we plant something near it? He looked at her, surprised. You thinking of planting? I was raised around gardens. My mother kept one until she passed. I haven't had a patch of my own since. She glanced at him. I thought maybe if we cleared some earth, I could try. Israel ran his hand through the tall grass. If you're willing to haul water with a yoke, you could get squash in by the end of the week. Maybe beans. I'm willing, she said. He watched her, the way she looked at the land like it could be coaxed into gentleness. He hadn't expected that. He'd thought she might want stillness, a place to rest. He hadn't thought she'd want to grow anything. On the way back, she asked, do you always take in strangers? No, but you took me in. I did. Why? He walked a few steps farther before saying, because you looked like you'd been standing in a storm for too long. She didn't answer, just walked beside him, eyes ahead. That evening, Josephine brought out the oil lamp and trimmed the wick. The light cast long shadows on the walls, and she sat at the small table with her sewing, patching one of Israel's shirts where the sleeve had worn thin. You don't have to do that, he said from the doorway where he'd been cleaning his rifle. I know. He stepped inside. You don't feel strange here, she threaded the needle again. I felt strange most of my life. This is the first place I don't. He walked over slow and sat across from her. I keep wondering if this is real, she added. If I'll wake up and find myself back on that church step. You won't. I believe you, she said. Israel rested his forearms on the table. You still want to be here, she looked up, hands stilling. Yes. He leaned forward, voice low. Then I'll make sure you never have to leave. Josephine reached across the table and set her hand over his. Her fingers were small, calloused at the edges, steady. I didn't ask for a protector, she said. I know. But I want one, she added, softer. And I want you. His throat worked as he swallowed. Then you have me. She stood slowly and came around the table. He met her there, rising to his feet. When she stepped into his arms, it wasn't with hesitation, it was with choice. He held her close, her cheek against his chest, her breath warm through his shirt. The wind picked up outside, brushing against the cabin walls. But inside there was only stillness and the quiet certainty of two people who had found what they weren't sure they'd ever have again. Not safety. Not comfort, but belonging. And in the hush that followed, neither one of them needed to speak it out loud. By midweek, the heat had settled into the land like a waiting thing. Israel had shifted his work to the cooler hours, splitting fence posts before dawn and riding out to check the upper spring just after dusk. Josephine kept to the garden plot she'd marked out near the bend in the dry arroyo, clearing stones with her skirts tied up at the knees and her sleeves rolled high. She didn't ask for help. She worked until her palms blistered. Israel found her there one evening, kneeling beside the rows she'd made, planting the first of the beans with a rusted trowel he hadn't used in years. Her braid had come loose in the back, and dust clung to her in streaks. She didn't look up when he approached. "You planning to keep going after dark?" he asked. "I will, if it gets these in before the moon turns," she said, brushing hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. He crouched beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "You always drive yourself like this. I never had the luxury of waiting," she said. "If something needed doing, I did it. Else it didn't get done." She pressed a seed into the earth, smoothed the soil over it, and moved to the next. He watched her fingers. "You think this land owes you something?" "No," she said. "I owe it something, for letting me stay." That night they sat at the edge of the porch while the sky darkened around them. The crickets had started up, and somewhere near the barn a cow let out a low, restless sound. Josephine leaned her head against the post beside her. "Do you think it's strange that we married before we even knew where the other was from?" Israel rested his boot heel on the step. "I don't think it's strange. I think it was necessary. I was born in Missouri," she said, "west of the river. My father was a cooper, made barrels for riverboats until the war took everything." He didn't ask what happened after. She hadn't brought up her father before, and he understood what it meant that she was doing so now. "I used to walk with him to the river every morning to watch the steamboats come in," she went on. "He'd say every one of them carried someone's hope. I didn't understand it then. And now I think he meant that people always move towards something, even if they don't know what it is yet." Israel looked out across the darkening pasture. "You think you moved toward me? I think I didn't know what I was moving toward until you opened your door." A quiet passed between them. He turned his head. "You ever want children?" She didn't answer right away. "I used to think I'd never have the chance. Now I wonder if I'd know how." "You'd know." She looked over at him. "Do you?" "I've buried too many things to be certain of much," he said. "But I'd like a life that grows." Josephine didn't smile, but her eyes stayed on him longer than they had before, and the air between them shifted again, something low and sure and building. Later, when she lay down beside him, her back to the wall and his arm resting lightly across her waist, she spoke into the hush. "I don't want to wait for happiness like it's something far off. "You don't have to," he said. Her fingers found his where they rested against her ribs. "Then let's live like we've already found it." He pressed his face into her hair, breathing deep. Neither of them spoke again, but the silence they shared was fuller than words. It held promise, not just of comfort, but of a life shaped by choice, by care, and by the kind of love that doesn't announce itself, only endures. The wind carried heat off the ridge as July settled deep into the earth. Josephine tied a damp cloth around her neck before stepping into the barn with a bucket of oats balanced on her hip. The air inside smelled of hay and sun-warmed wood, and the mare in the nearest stall nickered low when she entered. Israel had gone north before sunrise, helping a neighbor fell a cottonwood that had split in last week's storm. He'd left a strip of jerky wrapped in wax paper beside the stove, and a note carved into the soft bark of the firewood. "Back by supper." She hadn't needed the message, but she'd read the grooves in the wood with her fingers anyway. She brushed the mare's flank with slow, steady strokes, watching dust rise into the shafts of light. When she finished, she latched the stall and walked out to the pasture edge. The garden rose had taken hold since the rain 2 nights ago, leaves unfurling, stalks rising from the earth with stubborn, quiet strength. She'd planted them with nothing but hope in her hands, and now they stood like proof that something could come of it. Later that afternoon, she sat in the shade of the front porch, shelling peas into a tin bowl. Her knees were drawn up beneath her skirt, bare feet pressed against the warm boards. A trail of sweat slipped down her temple, but she didn't wipe it. She'd learned to live inside the heat. When Israel returned, his shirt was stiff with sawdust and sap. He stopped at the horse trough, dunked his hands, then ran water over the back of his neck. "Tree came down clean," he said, walking up the steps. "You get paid in anything besides sweat and splinters. Couple sacks of flour and a smoked ham," she nodded. "That'll keep us through August." He crouched beside her, watching her hands work. "You always this good at making do? I never had a choice." She glanced at him, then added, "But it feels different now, like it's not just surviving." Israel leaned back on his heels. "You think this'll hold?" "What we're building, I think it already is." He reached for a handful of peas and started helping. She didn't stop him. The sun began to dip behind the ridge. She heard the first chorus of crickets and the low call of a whip-poor-will further out. The hush of evening settled. "I've been thinking," he said, "we've got more land than we're using. If we cleared the south slope, we could build another room onto the cabin." "For what?" "Whatever we need," he said. "A drying room for herbs, maybe, or a cradle if it comes to that." She paused, fingers still. "You want that. I want whatever comes with you." She set the bowl aside and turned toward him fully. "I never thought I'd have another chance at a family. I made peace with that." "You can still keep that peace," he said. "Only now you don't have to do it alone." She leaned in, resting her brow against his. "If it happens, we'll meet it together. And if it doesn't, we're already whole." They stayed there until the light faded entirely, the bowl forgotten between them, their hands laced together on the porch rail. The weeks that followed passed like pages turned slow and sure. They built the new room with their hands and sweat, its beams raised under the late summer sun. Josephine dried wild mint and yarrow from the stream bend, hanging them in neat bundles beneath the rafters. Israel traded fence posts for a copper basin from a trader passing through. He carried it home like it was made of gold. By the first frost, the garden had gone to seed, but the cabin was thick with warmth. Josephine stood at the hearth one evening, her apron dusted with flour, and turned toward Israel with a quiet certainty in her eyes. She touched her hand to her belly. "It's early," she said, "but I know." Israel crossed the room and rested his hand over hers. "Then we'll wait together. Winter settled in, but it didn't hollow them. They read by lamplight and mended what needed mending. Israel carved a cradle from pine boards he'd stacked years ago and never found a use for. Josephine embroidered a quilt with a river stitched through the center, like the one she'd walked beside when she first came. The baby came in spring, with the wildflowers pushing up along the fence line and the bees reeling through the air. She was born quiet and strong, with a full head of dark hair and her mother's gray eyes. They named her Clara. Israel held her in the crook of one arm while Josephine rested, her hand curled around his sleeve. "You ever think we'd get here?" he asked softly. She smiled without opening her eyes. "No, but I never stopped walking toward it." Years passed, and the land held them gently. Clara grew tall and curious, her hands always in the dirt, asking questions about roots and clouds and the way chickens always looked like they were hurrying somewhere. Josephine taught her to stitch and boil yarrow for fevers. Israel taught her to ride and read tracks in the dust. They grew together, not fast, but deep. And as the years wore on, Israel planted more than beans. He planted trees. He built a second barn. He kissed his wife every morning by the door and every night beside the fire. And Josephine, who had once walked until her feet bled and her hope wore thin, now walked only as far as the garden gate, hand in hand with the man who had never asked her to be anything but herself. Their love was not loud. It was not sudden. It did not burn quick and vanish. It endured. And in the quiet light of each morning, it rose again.